in one room some of the very best minds in the energy sector for a high-level conversation about the future of energy in Jamaica. Now, with the government of Jamaica having set an ambitious target of getting to 50% renewables by the year 2030, the heat is on. Pardon me, the journalist in me can never avoid a pun. And the conversation here this afternoon is all about how do we get there. And you're going to be hearing from some of our fantastic speakers. In just a little while, we'll be introducing them to you. But first, on behalf of the Canadian High Commissioner and the Commission, I want to welcome you to this policy and regulatory masterclass on the climate smart approach. And the name of the event has been very strategically chosen. That in itself should tell you something about speakers you'll be hearing this afternoon. I'm your moderator, Dion Jackson-Millen. Welcome to those here in the room, as well as those of you watching on YouTube. Special welcome to Minister Matthew Samuda, who is with the Ministry of Economic Growth and Job Creation. He has responsibility for water, environment, and climate change. Obviously, a very critical ministry to the conversation about moving towards clean energy. But first, let me invite to give you her own very warm welcome and share her thoughts on this very important topic, Her Excellency Emina Tarkovic, the Canadian High Commissioner to Canada and the Bahamas. Your Excellency.
Thank you. So I threw them because, to be honest, it felt really awkward to be there with my back to the speakers. But let me start, of course, by welcoming the Senator, Honourable Matthew Samuda. I won't go through everyone's titles again because I think you'll all introduce yourselves. Ian Munro, who's a partner with Goling in Toronto. Mr. Howard Shearer, who's the chair of the Board of the Energy Council of Canada. Mr. Jacob Eyring, who's the President and CEO of the Energy Council of Canada. And of course, thank you to Mrs. Diane Jackson-Miller, our moderator. Distinguished ladies and gentlemen, Canadian companies and partners tuning in online. I'm not the expert here, and I have to say I've spent a couple of hours with these gentlemen this morning, and I'm excited. I've learned more about energy and the regulatory framework than I ever thought I would, and I think you're in for a treat. So I'm delighted to be here with you today, and it's a very important and timely conversation as our respective countries transition to clean and smart economies. It is also, of course, fortuitous, as Mrs. Miller mentioned, that the government of Jamaica has decided to facilitate the addition of 200 megawatts of electric generation from renewable sources. So we're very excited about that. And certainly that's a very ambitious target. Canada welcomes this announcement, and I hope that we will all capitalize on this opportunity to connect and exchange in ways that will rebound to the benefit of both Canada and Jamaica. And I think someone mentioned the 50% target. Your Prime Minister Holness actually stressed that to the diplomatic community last month. I think we were very excited to see that the national energy policy is looking towards 50% renewables. And this is a key sector for possible investment in Jamaica. The net zero transformation to a clean economy is already causing huge industrial, economic, and geopolitical shifts, probably the quickest and most pronounced in our lifetime. Perhaps not quick enough, so I think we're seized with the moment, and certainly as we see the climate change, it's top of mind in countries, including Canada. It's changing the nature of our work and the shape of the energy landscape. Therefore, that road to net zero means developing and using new technologies throughout our country's economies. Countries need to keep investing in strengthening their industrial bases in order to make them more investment and innovation friendly. The Government of Canada is taking strong action to fight climate change while accelerating our path to a 100% net zero electricity future. To this end, and since 2015, Canada has invested over 100 billion Canadian dollars in climate action and clean growth. In Canada, we have set our net zero targets to provide the predictability and transparency that businesses need to invest in the clean tech market, the fastest growing investment sector globally. Canada is also a strong innovator and producer of clean technology and climate solutions, and is ready to meet the world's needs. Canadian companies are well positioned to address global challenges and have the capacity to export their products and services while helping other countries and their economies address their communities towards the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development and net zero emissions targets. Internationally, Canadian clean technology companies punch well above their weight. Just like Jamaica in track and field. I don't know if people are watching Champs, but you guys are doing really well again. For the 5th consecutive year, several Canadian companies were named to the prestigious Global Cleantech 100 list, a list that identifies the most innovative and promising private cleantech companies from around the world, which are expected to have a significant market impact over the next 5 to 10 years. With 13 Canadian companies on the 2022 list, Canada has more featured companies than any country other than our southern neighbor, the United States. Additionally, Canada ranked first in the G20 and fourth globally on the most recent Global Clean Technology Innovation Index. So it's a bit of a joke because I always like to plug Canada, and obviously I'm the Canadian High Commissioner, so we're obviously like the best at this, or one of the best. Clean technology companies are among the main drivers of economic growth in Canada and have expanded their global export business by more than 60% from 2012 to 2021. It is important to note that this sector is predominantly composed of small and medium-sized enterprises that provide good and well-paying jobs for 210,000 Canadians, which drives economic prosperity while helping to meet our shared climate commitments. Canada's leading clean technologies include solutions in renewable energy, water and wastewater, energy storage, energy efficiency, smart grid, hydrogen technologies, carbon capture, utilization and storage, and waste to value. These sectors are important areas for building collaboration with partner countries. One of the most frequently asked questions that policymakers and regulators have is, how will the energy cleantech sector help countries achieve their stated climate goals? For cleantech to deliver net zero globally, there will be a need for strong and resilient supply chains, financing investment in energy projects, strategic, effective policy and regulatory frameworks that incentivize clean energy development, and regulatory readiness with active stakeholder engagement. And I have to say, I didn't really appreciate fully how tough a job that will be, but I think Jamaica is starting to ask the right questions as well, so happy to be there. So an important element of regulatory readiness for Canada is strengthening international collaboration with international colleagues in order to leverage our knowledge and experience in addition to building trust and forging long-term collaborations. This afternoon, we are talking about getting to the net zero goal by 2050. We have assembled Canadian and Jamaican policy and regulatory experts and business persons, some of who are joining us virtually, to discuss and work together to ensure that the best and most innovative ideas emerge to help realize our respective climate goals and timelines. This is why we're meeting this afternoon, Canada and Jamaica, partner countries with strong traditional ties, and I'm not going to talk about rum and saltfish, but can, of course, and economic cooperation agreements, which consistently support global climate action. So let me conclude by just saying how pleased I am to be here, and I feel this is a very timely meeting. I'd also like to thank my staff who've put this together. I think Sophie's there, and Yasmin was at the front, the team. Thank you, everybody, for participating. I'm really looking forward to the conversation today. Thank you.
Just need to see you in the stadium on Saturday. Okay, now Senator Matthew Samuda is going to be giving us some remarks now. Senator Samuda is one of the most powerful across the environment. He was the architect of the plastic ban that I think will tell you a lot of us gave him a lot of grief for in terms of how it would work. And whereas implementation may not have been perfect, it's undeniably been a huge step forward for us in Jamaica in terms of how we look at waste generation, waste reduction, and what plastic, for instance, is doing to our environment. So no better person to contribute to this discussion when we talk about the importance of using. Senator.
Thank you so much, Leanne. I'll remind you of that introduction the next time you're interviewing me. It is indeed a pleasure to join the esteemed panel, and indeed I'm thankful for the invitation from the Canadian High Commission, a long trusted, reliable, and predictable partner of Jamaica. The discussion around clean tech and around energy is tied to Jamaica's prospects for prosperity. Jamaicans have gotten poorer every time there's been a global spike in oil prices. You go back through all of the crises that we've faced as an independent nation, every time there's been global instability or any geopolitical conflict that causes oil price spikes, Jamaicans get poorer for as long as we've measured the poverty rate. And ultimately, any government, first and foremost priority has to be reduction of poverty and improving the quality of lives. And that, I think, is perhaps the most important measure for any government. So if we're that tied, or rather our prospects are that tied and that closely related to energy prices, it should come as no surprise as to why we have spent so much time focusing on the need to move to reliable, predictable, clean, and indeed cheaper technology, especially as it relates to our energy production. Now, Jamaica is an island state, but it's an island state with 70% of our population living within 5 kilometers of the sea. Most of that population lives in low-lying areas. So for us, climate change is not an academic concept. We're already seeing the impact of slow onset events by way of saltwater intrusion in our water supply, deteriorating soil quality, and indeed reducing pollination rates. It's not just the almost theatric events such as a hurricane that we have to fear. We're already seeing the impact of gradual sea level rise. We're seeing extended periods of drought, and we're seeing some rainfall, certainly that we would have seen last year, where you have a month's rainfall in about 53 minutes in an afternoon. There's no infrastructure that's going to be designed to deal with that. So climate change is a reality. Now, often because Jamaica is described as a dark country, because we don't really use that much energy, because the realities of our economy has not been robust enough to consume the sorts of energy that you need to facilitate the sort of economic growth, whether you're a services-based or manufacturing economy. We say, well, why are we looking to cut emissions? You know, emissions, I'd say, are the first cousin of the climate change discussion. You know, emissions also contribute negatively to human health and to other environmental, other deleterious factors for the environment. But generally, if you're a country that is at the level of risk, or faces the level of risk rather, that we face because of climate change, it would be reckless, it would be nonsensical for you to not contribute to the global reduction in emissions which cause this scourge. Now, so it's a moral issue. That's the first point. It is a moral issue. But it's also a practical issue. I mentioned the absolute need for predictability and stability in our energy prices, as well as price reductions. It is absolutely critical for Jamaica to become or move closer to energy independence. It is the only way you're going to build that pillar that eventually your economy can be built on. And we've discussed, I think this morning, a number of ways that this can indeed be achieved. Government has been quite clear. It was the 11th country globally to submit its updated NDCs, being its nationally determined contributions, which under the UNFCCC's framework, which is the Paris Agreement, which calls for particular transparency and calls for governments to submit these contributions in line with how they will help the global targets. Jamaica was the 11th, and those targets are that we would cut 40% of emissions by 2030. And one of the ways that we will do that is by ensuring that we get to 50% renewables in that period as well. We're also obviously working on a number of other initiatives, which we can get into in a bit, but generally that's the kind of the large-scale, broad-based targets that we have set. Now, how are we going to do that? What is our energy usage like, and what are our prospects for renewable energy? Land, wood, and water. The reality is water is also both, one of your largest prospects for energy production, but also, unfortunately, one of your largest consumers of energy. The first time I received a brief from the NWC, I'm sure VP Glasser Cunningham there will tell you that I nearly dropped off my chair when they showed me the $6 million light bill for the month. It was shocking to see that many zeros in terms of your consumption. So I know we all, when you get an email related to your energy bill at the end of the month, everybody takes a deep breath before they open it. But you can imagine what he and his team go through when they see that general bill at the end of the month. So the very thing that can help us to produce energy, which is certainly through our hydroelectric possibility, in pumping water and providing potable water to our citizens, is one of our largest is our largest consumer, rather. So that's an interesting nexus. It's one of the reasons that all of our large-scale projects contemplate and evaluate opportunities for integration of the energy and the water sector. And we are playing our part in that regard. Even outside of the 200 megawatts that we expect to go to public tender later this year, The National Water Commission last year would have announced a project to cover the Mona Reservoir with a floating solar system which will provide 45 megawatts of stable, clean energy to the grid at significantly reduced costs, certainly much less than the 42 cents per kilowatt hour that we all pay. But that doesn't cover the full story. The reality is Jamaica has the prospects for hydroelectricity, has the prospects for significant increases in wind generation, has the prospects for solar energy. I'm sure throughout the course of the discussion, we'll dive into what each of those prospects look like, Leon, but generally the government is very clear that it will engage all three to ensure that we hit our mitigation targets and to ensure that we create stability and reductions in prices for energy, because it is not just a moral obligation, but it is an absolute need for us to be able to create the stability economically. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Senator. Let me just remind you of our panelists who we have speaking to us today. Ian Monroe from Gowling WLG in Toronto. He's a partner who specializes in the area of energy regulation and policy. We also have with us Howard Shearer, familiar name to us in Jamaica, who chairs the board of the Energy Council of Canada, and Jacob Irvin, who is president and CEO of the Energy Council of Canada. Now, I know we're going to do a little bit of Q&A at the end, but given the kind of depth of experience and knowledge in the room, I do want to pause as well a couple of times during the discussion so we can get comments and questions from those of you who are here in the audience, and I think we're going to be trying to get some comments from people on YouTube as well, if we do get those coming in. So, Mr. Shearer, I'm going to ask you to kick us off, because as we said, this ambitious target, necessary. I don't think anybody would argue that it's not necessary at all, but I mean, in the space of a relatively few years, we moved from saying we were moving towards 20% renewables to 30%, and now we're at 50%. Estimates I saw is that we'll be requiring investment of about $1.2 billion US. What are some of the issues that arise for you as we seek towards moving towards this target?
Thank you. So this is a very intriguing goal. As you move to renewables, the question is what you define as renewables to begin with. And it's not only wind, it's not only solar, it's not only pump storage, it's not only hydro, but in today's world it's also nuclear as a point of reference. That's one. The challenge in terms of percentage of renewables compared to baseload is, of course, traditionally it was thought that the grid stability was important and 20% was the target. As the years evolve with the issue of storage and battery, it has now reached 30%, and indeed there's a new goal now looking at 50%, as stated by the minister. So grid stability also means not only the generation aspect, but the grid is so key, not only for to service underserved economies, but the stability and the integrity and the reliability of the grid becomes so important. So the investment cannot only be in generation, it has to be in grid integrity as well. And last but not least, I would say, whatever the conversation is a project that certainly is important to the economic development of the country, as certainly our center certainly realizes. And therefore, whether it's generation or grid or renewables, the placement or the deployment of such assets must be strategically placed within the context of economic development. Whether economic development driven by providing obviously cheaper energy rates to businesses, empowering education, empowering development. It all has to, the bottom line, drive the economy to the X percentage increases in growth per year that Jamaica needs to remain certainly to achieve its goals and deliver value to its people. And in doing so, my last comment is looking at the Masterclass regulation aspect, which we have a very renowned person here. Regulation becomes so crucial. Regulation must be balanced. It must address the safety, obviously, first and foremost. But it must not be a barrier to investment. It must be a regulation that can encourage investment. And more important, the speed of implementation of regulatory laws is so crucial. It is important that we do not take unnecessary time. Capital moves swiftly, and capital will arrive where it's welcome, and it can be deployed effectively. There is so much room or scope for capital elsewhere in the world. We have to be agile, smart with our regulation to be able to create the type of environment that certainly we can succeed in attracting that capital and realizing the renewable goals that we want, and of course the economic drivers that we need to achieve. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Mr. Monroe, let me ask you to pick up on that in terms of the regulatory aspect of it and some of the things we need to start looking at there.
Thank you. I think the High Commissioner used the term regulatory readiness, and that's a brilliant term. And I think it's a brilliant term because I think it's very important in the mix of issues that we're talking about here that Minister Samuda has relayed to us he's working on and interested in and committed to, that roles of the various actors need to be clear. And that provides transparency, certainty, stability, and ultimately a better outcome. So what I mean by that is the government's role is to set targets. And, I'm not an expert on the targets, but the government's made a policy decision, 40% emissions reduction by 2030, 50% renewables by 2030. That's a decision that's been taken. In terms of implementation, I think that the utility that's responsible for implementing this is going to have to figure out how to do that and cost it and advise the government. I think the regulator is going to have to figure out its role in that and advise the government. But each of those actors has a discrete role. In respect of the regulatory role, I was lamenting to my friends this morning, I hear this so often, regulatory barriers. Regulation has to be faster. Regulation has to be better. I urge people to think about what specifically are the regulatory barriers. Is it really regulation that's holding this up, or is it policy clarity from the government, or is it the willingness of industry to risk their capital? And if there's something about the regulatory framework that is actually a barrier, then let's identify it clearly and remove that barrier. So the regulator needs to be ready. It needs to be ready to react quickly and definitively and on an informed basis, but it's not the job of the regulator to drive the transition of the industries or of your society. It's the role of the regulator to moderate that transition, to help it along, to guide it, to facilitate it, but not to drive it. And so, I caution people, let's be careful what we say when we say that regulation has to be better. What's the problem? Let's fix it. I do know that the Jamaican government is in the process, I believe, of reviewing or will reinitiate its review of the Electricity Act. I think that's very wise. The sector's changed. JPS will know better than I do. The way electricity is generated and delivered and consumed is changing as we speak. And I think economic regulation, which was traditionally to protect customers from monopolies and to allow long-term investors the security of recovery of and on their capital, that's what economic regulation was. I think it's changing now. I think there's a lot more competition for energy services. I think the lines around the natural monopoly are blurrier than they were. And so I do think regulation has to reinvent itself. I think it's very opportune time to review the electricity regulatory framework in Jamaica and make sure it's fit for modern purpose. And the regulator needs to work to keep up, but the regulator is not the leader here. The government's the leader, and I think it's important to remember that. So place responsibility where it's due, but not undue.
I'm going to throw back to the Senator just a moment to take that up. But let me bring this argument up in terms of some of the lessons that we need to be putting on as we work towards this new paradigm.
Well, thanks again, everyone, for inviting us to come speak to you about energy and regulation. I think Canadians, they often say that we're quite polite, and I understand that if we had a competition between Jamaicans and Canadians to see who the most polite was, we'd be battling to say who could say who's sorry first. So in many ways, I'd like to apologize. I'd like to start by apologizing. Is that I think as Canadians, I don't think we've reached out enough to the rest of the world to talk about energy in particular or regulation. And I think we've got a lot of good information to share, a lot of lessons learned. We've had some hard lessons that we've learned along the way. But something to know about our country maybe, and it's good to think about in terms of energy regulation, is we have our 10 different provinces. And in many ways, it's like we have 10 different countries within Canada when it comes to energy in particular. You know, we're a federation, we have these provinces that have their own governments, and they have their own energy regulation as well. And so I would dare say that if you'd like to pursue any avenue or any area, we've got a province you could talk to. If you want to pursue more of the vertically integrated, publicly owned utility model, we have those in Canada. If you want to talk about a fully deregulated system where there's competitive generation, we have that as well. And we make it work in different ways. And so I think we have a diversity in our approach toward energy regulation that is very helpful and that would allow us, in speaking to you, is to, if we learn from you how you want to do things, we can provide helpful advice. And we can also, the High Commissioner was mentioning earlier this morning that we're very good at also sharing lessons from where we've made mistakes. Those, you know, the hard lessons, the things that the lessons you learn in your DNA, because you didn't get it right the first time, but the second time round you did. And we do pride ourselves on being very open in that regard. And I'd say one more thing that's very important when you speak to Canadians about energy, we pride ourselves on the way that we do energy. I often say that Canada is a very young country, but it's a very old and sophisticated, established democracy. Not unlike Jamaica itself. It's something we have in common, I think. And the way that we produce our energy really matters. It needs to be respectful of the people who it serves. I'll often say that Canada is a responsible energy producer because we are a responsive energy producer. We change. And it's the people within our country who make us change. And I think that I sense the same sort of spirit from this country. And I think there's a lot of areas where we can engage and learn from each other as we all try to get to a net zero by 2050 in Canada's case, or in our electricity system, we're trying to get there by 2035, even sooner. So we have a great starting point to work from. We've learned a lot of tough lessons along the way, but we're really excited to be able to share this more with you.
Senator, let me come back to you. That issue of government driving the process and the estimate I had mentioned that I had seen of $1.2 billion US needed for investment. We heard Mr. Scherer speak about not just generation, but grid stability as well. Do we have enough of the policies in place that are readying us to prepare for that kind of investment? Enough incentives and enough policy direction around that?
Let's start first with investor interest. I think there's enough investor interest to drive the deployment of $1.2 billion for energy, $3.5 billion for water resilience. I mean, there is significant investor interest in Jamaica, which is a good starting point. If we look at our recent history and even two transactions that I've been exposed to, certainly working with the team at DBJ and NWC in our space, you would say, well, the proof of the pudding hasn't been in the eating in terms of the time that we've been able to deploy that investment. So in the context of the most recent one, and I'll give you I'd say the worst example in terms of length of time that something would take, and then how we're going to fix that, I think that's a good place to start. The Rio Cobre water treatment plant to be built at Content was a 13-year discussion. We don't have 13 years to 2030.
That's a 1-3?
1-3. So it was a 13-year discussion. No, it wasn't a discussion every single day, and there were lulls and there were points where one could argue that the government across administrations may not have had policy coherence, but the point is we had a discussion for 13 years before a contract was signed. That's not going to have us hit our energy targets. So I would start by saying, no, it's not there yet. But we have identified and spent a lot of time studying the points of friction. I think that would have started even through the Economic Growth Council in 2016 and several other policy changes and legislative changes that you're seeing now would have come from that significant study. I mean, we've also benefited from studies from all of our multilateral partners at different points, and those points of friction are being steadily removed and smoothed out where it needs to be. The first one, in the context of the energy transition, is the Electricity Act. That is before a joint select committee. I believe we are nearing policy coherence. There are obviously some final elements that go into ensuring that that is the right construct, but that is going to be particularly important. I think in recent times, the amendments to the Procurement Act also give you room to move a little more expeditiously. Not carelessly, but certainly expeditiously. So I think that those are two major steps that, using how you've described it in terms of the regulatory framework, I think we're stepping in the right direction because there is greater policy coherence. There is investor interest. And I think those two elements tell you that it is indeed possible for 2030. Yeah.
Okay. So Cheryl, let me go back to something you mentioned a little earlier, because you said in defining what counts as renewables, there's nuclear as well. I'm sure you probably know there's a lot of nervousness whenever people say nuclear, especially in the context of a small island developing state, where people feel we have limited acreage for things like disposal of waste. Is that a recommendation you would really make for Jamaica to look at as we talk about renewables?
Absolutely. So I think just a couple of comments on nuclear. I think the technology for nuclear has evolved significantly. So for example, the small modular reactor, the designs are new, they're passive, they're very safe, and they're being deployed now globally as a point of reference. For transparency, and governance purposes, I work for Hitachi. We have a nuclear division, and Hitachi's BWR300 has been chosen to build approximately 8 units in Ontario. Also in the United States, TVA, and also in Poland. But more important, I think the safety systems today, is much smaller units, 1,000 megawatt units. They go from anywhere from 50 to 300 megawatts as a point of reference. So definitely, I think it's an option. Simply, it will stabilize the price of the fuel. And of course, nuclear is the only, I would say, generation where, for example, the cost of the treatment of the waste is upfront known, and part of the process is that money goes in the bank to support that renewable aspect, treatment of that waste, when it's expired, maybe 20 years from now. So there's certainty in price for 20 years at a minimum, for example, and cost-wise, I think it's very competitive. So the answer is yes. I'd extend the comment even further, just to stimulate another thought, is that fit for purpose. As Jacob would say, for Jamaica's energy security, all fuels need to play a role. Wind, solar, nuclear. And bearing in mind that from the regulatory point of view, we have to take into consideration the resiliency aspect that is crucial to Jamaica. We are prone to hurricanes. We are prone to earthquakes, for example. And so, however we place our assets strategically, from a regulatory point of view, that also has to be taken into consideration, because resiliency becomes so important in a regulatory situation. That's just my comment.
Thank you so much. I'm just going to see if the other panelists have any comment on that, and then I'll take the first set of comments or questions from the floor. So there'll be people with 2 mics that will be going around that you can just indicate in a few minutes if you would like to comment. Mr. Irvin, anything you'd want to add on that in terms of the nuclear issue?
I think what I could add is that Canada is very fortunate in the sense that we are involved in every form of energy that you can imagine. And we do fight above our weight in many of them, I would say. We are the world's 2nd largest hydropower generator after China. It's China first, Canada second. And very interested to hear the water nexus issues that the minister is very concerned about and raised. We understand this, the importance of this in Canada. It's interesting to note that many hydropower dams or hydro facilities that are built around the world started out as water control management features, and were then figured out later, oh, if you add turbines to this, you can make electricity. Oh, and then you can make that electricity to pay for the dam that was originally put in place for water control reasons or navigation or shipping or what have you. And Canada has a long history in that. And we are we are the last OECD country in the world with undeveloped hydropower potential, and we have been building it consistently for the last 100 years. So there's actually not a lot of countries out there that have a lot of expertise and that have sharp expertise in that area. So this is the kind of area where we could lend a lot of assistance. But nuclear is one of those as well. We've operated safely for over 50 years within our country, and it is definitely added to our ability to address climate change. We have and our electricity system is over 80% non-emitting. And you're understanding the role of 50% renewables for Jamaica, laudable goal that we like to help to get you to. We are at 62% in Canada already due to our hydropower strength and facility. But we've been adding the new renewables as well. I would contend, Jamaica, you've been adding the new renewables at a better rate than we have. And we have some things to learn from you on that front in terms of wind and solar. It's quite impressive what you've managed to do here in this country. So there's opportunity for some really great exchanges here. So I'm excited for more with the panel.
Mr. Monroe?
I think the topic is nuclear, so I'm certainly not a nuclear expert. I think a couple of things, though, I would note just from observing the sector. One is, when we talk about nuclear today, it's not the same nuclear that Jacob was referring to, that the backbone of our Canadian system was built on. As Howard mentioned, these are small plants, they're deployable, they're ultra-safe plants, they generate a fraction of the waste. So I think it's important to remember that. They are much more flexible and modular in that sense. They can be added in discrete chunks, which is very important for Jamaica. I think the size of your system is about 1,100 megawatts of capacity, if I'm not mistaken. So, a 200 to 300 megawatt chunk of capacity is a big addition. So is there a role for nuclear in Jamaica? Maybe. I think that's a good question for the experts here, who will have to take the renewables already on stream, already committed to, and the heavy fuel oil phase-out requirements, the decarbonization requirements, put it all in the models and figure out, does a 250 or a 300 megawatt chunk of nuclear fit here? It's maneuverable to a large extent, I learned this morning, certainly much larger than the legacy systems. And maneuverability is important because you get a load shape, and people, plunking on renewables will know when the wind's blowing and the sun's shining, it's coming into the system, and when the wind stops and at nighttime, it's not coming into the system, and you got to supplement it with something. So you got to shape the supply to the demand. Nuclear historically is not terribly maneuverable. I think that's changed now, but it operates differently. And the one point about the waste, Ms. Jackson-Miller, you mentioned, not a lot of place for waste. I'd be surprised if waste ended up permanently in Jamaica, even if there is a Jamaican nuclear facility. I think we're going to see the emergence of an industry if these facilities actually take off, and there's a tremendous promise of centralized waste processing and ultimately storage, long-term storage as a business. So I think the on-site storage is temporary, and then I think the waste probably gets moved somewhere else. A much bigger facility with many more streams of waste coming in that can process it and stabilize it and secure it efficiently. So I'm not sure the land use is really an issue. But there are a lot of issues, and I think, Jacob reminds me, we've talked about this already today, public acceptability is critical. That's the business you're in. And people need to understand what we're talking about when we talk about, the GE, Hitachi nuclear and modern nuclear. It's different. And I think there's a real public education curve to be climbed, and I think that's really important.
Senator, I have to ask you, because some years back we had kind of started the conversation and the public went, and we really haven't had much engagement on the issue since then. Is it in the arena at all for discussion?
So I'd say I'd allow these three gentlemen who are experts to convince you first, so that you can help us convince the public before the conversation moved too deeply. But obviously the Ministry of Science, Energy and Technology studies all options, and I think all things are being studied. I'm not sure that all things are being moved towards, but it is being studied, as is green hydrogen, as is a rooftop survey to determine what the true solar capacity is of our buildings. So there are a number of studies going on, and I think the important point is that our solution is going to be through a mix of deployments. But as I said, the public, and as you know, I mean, I think we've gone through about 2 waves of discussions on nuclear but I think the public acceptance would have to come for the discussion to move beyond anything other than a study.
Okay.
And if I could just add on, I'm supposed to be the regulatory contributor here. So from a regulatory perspective, nuclear regulation effectively is safety regulation. It's very specific. It's highly specialized. We have a tremendous capacity in Canada in our Federal Nuclear Regulatory Agency. It is really state-of-the-art safety and standards regulation. And so developing that capacity in Jamaica, if nuclear is to be an option, will be, if pardon the pun, critically important. But also can provide the public with a lot of comfort, because these are very, very highly regulated facilities for all kinds of reasons, national security reasons, not the least. And as a result, they are ultra safe. I mean, they are really remarkably safe facilities, even the older ones, and we're talking about new state-of-the-art safety systems, and so that's an important part of the discussion.
And I've had the opportunity to tour a few in different parts of the world. They really aren't it's not the same nuclear discussion of the 90s. That is very clear. Is it the discussion for Jamaica? That still remains to be determined.
Okay.
If I may just
Please.
one comment to that, just to clarify. The size of the Jamaican grid could not take a 300 megawatt reactor. The reactors that are 50, 100, and 120. So for example, it could be, so you could add actually capacity as needed, starting from a smaller reactor and building up to a new reactor, to a larger reactor. But roughly, I think the grid, 15% aspect, depending on the grid size, could be nuclear.
Okay, thank you so much. We can take comments from the floor now, if any comments or questions at this point.
Maybe I could build quickly on the point of nuclear as well with the smaller reactors in Canada, where we're looking at deploying a lot of them in the future is in our remote and northern communities, where there isn't large demand for electricity, but where electricity has to be right-sized. And when you look across our remote northern communities, in some ways they can be seen as islands unto themselves. They have difficulty being connected to the rest of the country. And in fact, we were talking about some of our issues with climate change. In Canada, the way it manifests itself is in melting of permafrost, and actually our ability to access some of these communities. Ice roads, if you've ever watched Ice Road Truckers, it's a reality in our country. We get goods to people in northern communities on those roads, and we have to send them diesel fuel. And that, of course, is one of the least popular emitting forms of energy. In Canada, we rely on it in the north. We want to get off that. And we see these SMRs as a potential in that regard. So though you're an island, we have a lot of similar circumstances to you that I think we can learn and bridge together.
Thank you so much. I see a gentleman here.
Hi, thank you all. I'm Jason Robinson, Vice President of the Jamaica Renewable Energy Association and CEO of Solar Buzz. Thank you all for being here and information. I didn't realize it'd be so nuclear focused. I'm even happier I came. I think, looking at nuclear is, in my opinion, a scary possibility, obviously, for Jamaica. I think there's a lot of policies here that we can do better at to even free up more renewables first. We battle, myself, Alex Hill is the president of the Renewable Association, on a daily basis a lot of policies that prevent the renewables from spreading, especially solar. So I think a lot more solar can be deployed here ahead of looking at the prospect of nuclear. I don't agree with Mr. Scherer that it's a renewable energy. I mean, it's finite and you mine uranium. So I do think that I respect how Minister Samuda answered. I think it's something that the government can look at, but not have a direct answer right now. But I really, in my opinion, don't think it fits for Jamaica. It might be a lot more safe now, but for the Caribbean and the size of the country, one slip up, and that's the end of us.
Let me ask you though, because you, and no, the discussion is not all about nuclear. That was one thought. But you said that when you started that you run into policy issues every day that you believe are preventing the spread of renewables. Can you elaborate on what those are and what you think needs to be changed?
Well, we have to apply for commercial net billing licenses on a regular basis to help the manufacturers, especially deploy renewables, and just the red tape that it takes to get these licenses through. I mean, I have clients waiting 18 months currently. I know they've revamped it recently, but that is one large aspect that really, holds back the spread of the renewable energy. The net billing policy, I think, really needs to be looked at and made a much easier way for us to deploy the licenses in a much faster fashion so that businesses can get their energy sold back to the grid in a quicker fashion.
Okay, thank you so very much. And that issue of net billing, I mean, that's a complaint we've heard over and over again in terms of impeding, as the gentleman was saying, the whole idea of renewables and the spread of renewables. How important is that kind of regulatory direction?
I think it's very important. So just before I address that, though, let me address the priorities of sources of energy. And I tend to agree with you. Solar and wind, especially for a country like Jamaica with a huge solar resource, should be kind of at the top of the stack, but they're non-dispatchable. And so the issue is to my mind, the issue is how much can you get on the system and still manage the system stably? And the rest of the technology should facilitate the integration of renewables. So I agree with you, you need to start with renewable. I think every system should, in particular yours, start with renewables. But there is a physical limit, and you know it better than I expect, and maybe you're nowhere near that yet, but the system has to balance. And whether a nuclear plant is the right way to balance that, or pump storage, if there's enough of it, or some other battery energy storage system, which I think now are kind of commercial at about 4 hours. So 4 hours will help during a 24-hour cycle, but over a couple of days, it's not going to stabilize the system. So these are all technical issues. Again, I'm sure you understand better than I do. But I agree with you. I think solar and wind needs to be the starting point, and then the pieces filled in around that. So if that's any comfort to you, I think that's the right approach. In respect of net billing, I mean, I think it's critical. I don't know what your net billing regime here is, but one thing I will say about net billing is, the word or the concept of net in there is there for a reason. So I think it's very healthy that prosumers, producing consumers, want to sell their output into the grid, but they are connected to that grid. They're going to draw on that grid sometimes. They're going to use it to inject their power. They need to pay for it. And so some of the complaints I hear, and I'm not sure if this applies here, but some of the complaints I hear about net billing as well, it's really not enough money to make this financially attractive to the customers we're trying to sell these arrays to, because they still have to pay a connection charge or a customer charge. Well, yeah, but they're driving those costs. So either it's economic or not. Now, if the government's policy is we want to encourage solar, so we're going to adopt a policy that favors those consumers and ignores those costs from the perspective of that consumer, that's the government's prerogative. But until then, there's a share of the cost those consumers need to pick up. So again, pardon me, but I haven't studied your net billing regime. I'm not sure if that's what applies, but commonly that's what I see. So the answer to your question is it's critical. You need to get it right. But stranding a bunch of costs and having wealthy consumers who can afford solar arrays shed those costs, and vulnerable consumers who can't afford solar arrays have to absorb those costs or use less power because they can't afford it, that's not the right balance. So that balance is pretty tricky usually.
I suspect you would be saying we're nowhere near the the maximum end that brings some of those other issues into play?
No, we're not too close to I think reaching the limit for solar on the grid. I think where we are now is really pushing government policy and working with the financial institutions to get more solar financing deployed faster for people. That's a big sticking point as well.
Yeah, and so that's a perfect example. So again, I said off the top, people talk about regulatory barriers. Regulation's too slow. There's so much red tape, and maybe there is. I think 2 years for a license for a small solar array is too long, in my experience. It needn't be that complicated. But you know, if the issue is financing, make the business case, that's not a regulatory issue, right? And the delay doesn't help. But so you need to prioritize what are the barriers, and I think this discussions like these help. We need to be clear so that the regulator can figure out what its role is, but you know, it's not, you know, the buck doesn't stop there, right? There are other parties responsible, including your sector, that need to figure out this financing.
We have a question or comment over this side.
Good afternoon. Thank you, Dion. My name is Vernon Douglas. I'm the CFO of JPS, which is the electric utility here. I have two questions, if you might permit me. One is for Mr. Monroe. I'd like to get your thoughts in terms of the views whether or not traditionally electric utilities were seen as having a captive audience. Therefore, regulators in the form of direct regulators or government might have approached the whole framework in that sense. For example, high taxes being levied on utilities as an easy captive point for consumers, or what I'll describe as social pricing structures within the electric utilities that make them unattractive for higher consumers who purchase from the grid. To what extent, based on where we are now, you think those days are behind us and regulators and governments need to shift?
It's a pleasure to meet you, and thank you for the question. And I'm going to start with a caveat that I am not an expert on the Jamaican energy politics system, nor a student of its history. I do know that, and I'm not sure that this is the case here, but I do know that there are in many jurisdictions, including some of those that I work in, there's a lot of baggage between the government and the utility. So I start with that caveat. And so you'll pardon any comments I make, given my self-proclaimed naivete in respect of the particular situation in history in Jamaica. But to answer your question, sir, so I do think, as I mentioned earlier, that the fundamental driver for economic regulation, which is the term I use to describe regulating prices effectively, is changing. I think one of the premises of your question was the monopoly nature of the utility as an essential service. And I do think that that is changing. We're seeing this buzz about distributed energy resources. I think the specter of grid defection, which is consumers kind of jumping ship and generating their own energy exclusively without a grid connection, I think that's overblown, frankly. I think it's going to happen, but I think it's going to be slow and gradual, and I think utilities are going to adapt and start to provide different sorts of services. They will be much more like in New York and California. New York's probably in the lead here examining this. There'll be much more kind of network service providers, distribution service providers. So kind of the highways for prosumers and consumers to connect and interact and optimize energy production and energy consumption. So I think that's going to change. I think regulation's going to have to change because of that. I think the consumer protection mandate is going to be different. I think the utility protection mandate is going to be different. You know, people, I'm always amazed, people talk about price regulation as there to protect consumers, and it's true. That's half of what it's there for. The part people forget, and I think you'll smile at me when I say this, is protecting the utility and its investment. And that's critical from a regulatory perspective, because if you don't do that, you don't get low cost of capital, which ultimately hurts customers. You don't want your investor to be spooked or at undue risk. You want an appropriate amount of risk, but an appropriate amount of protection if they're going to be asked to park capital in your jurisdiction for a long time, and it's a lot of capital. So I think all of that is changing. I don't know where it's going to end up, but I do think it requires a bit of flexibility, a bit of soul searching. And in respect of using the utility as kind of, and I think you referred to kind of taxing the utility more heavily because the customers are captive. Utilities should not be used from a rate-making perspective as a tool of social policy. I think losing price fidelity for the product that you sell, electricity, is unfortunate. I think it skews consumption decisions. I think it skews investment decisions, not only by the utility, but by other providers that want to be part of the system. So I think that's a really bad idea. I think utility rates should reflect cost to serve. Sometimes there's policy wrapped up in that, and I think that's, I used to be very averse to that. As I get older, I may be more of a pragmatist. I think there's a role for that. But it should not be a tool for fixing social issues or social development or social equity. And it should not be a cash cow for a government. I think that's unfortunate. I think that answers your question.
And if you might permit me, I have a second question. I think it's probably more directed at Minister Samuda, but any panelist might choose to chime in here. What are our goals to transition the unclean uses of energy to complement the cleaner renewables goals and aspirations we have? And I'm specifically speaking about automobile industry, in order for a small ecosystem like ours to create real synergies in order not to impact prices.
So I think it's well known and well articulated, or should be well known, that the government has changed its EV import policy. It's also changed the tax structure, which has made the importation of electric vehicles significantly more competitive than they were 12 months ago. Supply chain issues, which we knew at the time and was stated even when the policy was changing, hasn't allowed for the wave of EV importation that we expect to come, and we did expect that lag, and it was stated when we made the policy change. But that policy change is in place, and we're already seeing dealerships of EV brands as well as more established brands that we know in the market also now bringing EV lines into space. It's something that I would have hoped we were further ahead, but certainly with the disruptions coming out of COVID and with the war in Eastern Europe and Ukraine, that we're in a very different space than we would have liked to have been. But that is a major part of our emissions target. Yeah, it's not limited purely to energy generation. The government has started, albeit slowly, but has started the process of changing our national fleet to electric where possible. The team at NWC will tell you that every time we have an energy discussion, the discussion around our service vehicles being transitioned to electric where possible has come up. We're going to be buying significantly more vehicles, and they will be electric going forward. But that we believe offsets some of the issues that I think the team from the Solar Association see, because grid migration is a real issue. Not all grid migration is on their radar, because there are some large-scale customers, hotels and manufacturers, who have left the grid not using solar. The LNG wave that came had, some left in that space, and there have been other generation, other companies that have chosen other methods of generation, and that has affected the price of distribution. It has, and it has unfortunately left a greater share of the burden for the distribution costs on some of the poorest in society. So grid migration is a real issue, and it is one that we can't ignore, and that has, I think, led to some of the perceived policy dissonance in terms of how quickly net billing arrangements are facilitated, which is why I think the Electricity Act revision is so important, which is why I think bringing on that 200 megawatts now we're now at the right time to do that. And I think we've been working with JPS and other stakeholders to ensure that this is done in a systematic, strategic manner that doesn't cause a sort of social instability that can come if this isn't done carefully. It's the right thing to do, but it has to be implemented in the appropriate way. But just on the electric vehicle point, why I made the point that it will create some of the stability is that it will increase some of the consumption that will offset those who migrate in another way. We expect that to assist.
But at the same time, I know especially at the beginning, you kind of have to do, carrot and stick rather than big stick. But what's the kind of time frame beyond which you think we need to start pushing more strongly in terms of policy, in terms of regulation, to move towards more use of electric vehicles?
3 years ago. But the reality is the reality. We had particular disruptions in the global economy, and had we started pushing like that and then had the supply chain disruptions, you'd have had other issues, right? So I think now is really that time. Those changes that you'd have seen over the last couple of months are the beginning of that push. Government, still as the largest player in an economy this size, is already sending the signal. Yes, first 5 electric buses, others to be ordered. I think in the new fiscal year, the procurement is ready to go out. And even with some of the initiatives that we have with our partners, the Prime Minister would have announced the 4 million euro partnership we have with the German government, for instance, which is helping with that fleet. NWC has committed to purchasing the next set of vehicles being electric, and several other government entities moving toward electric vehicles. Once the government moves in a particular way with how it spends, the rest of the economy is dragged along, because it is still the biggest player in the economy.
Okay.
I just offer a comment on electrification. So we have a great organization in Canada, Plug and Drive, and it's a nonprofit, and their objective is to introduce electric vehicles to consumers, fleets as well, but including personal vehicles. And the president of Plug and Drive, a woman named Kara Clareman, told me a while ago that the real issue for getting electric vehicles to a jurisdiction is a government requirement that vehicle manufacturers sell a certain percentage of electric vehicles in the jurisdiction from their allotment, their production. Because what's happening is that because of the supply chain crunches, the vehicles are in relatively short supply, and so the manufacturers are sending them to jurisdictions where if you don't sell a certain percentage of EVs, you can't sell anything. And so that's where the cars are going. So the incentives and the consumer pull is important. But right now, I think what's important is kind of a very strong government policy saying if you want to sell cars in our jurisdiction, X percent needs to be electric, because then you'll get them. Otherwise, you're not going to get them.
If I may just comment to that just quickly. Just one quick comment on that. The reality is that there are not enough critical minerals being mined to meet the production requirements for electric vehicles. And there's a huge, for example, deficit in lithium. And also, in terms of the critical metals that are being mined, a huge ESG issue in terms of how it's mined, whether it comes from Chile or Peru or Congo, or Brazil, or the Far East. So the supply of electric vehicles will be challenged. Also, the charging infrastructure is challenged. Also, the battery requirement is challenged simply because of critical metals. And as I mentioned, the mining industry will need to invest $1.7 trillion to be able to meet the demand required by 2030. I don't see that type of investment going in so quickly. So I think there's time, per se, but we never have enough time. We have to move fast, whether in our regulation or whether in our preparation for infrastructure, because if you don't have the structure, and how will you be able to have the production of electric, because that's your need. So that's just my comment.
There's one element to the electric vehicle discussion which I don't expect would be the concern, certainly in most provinces in Canada. In Jamaica, it affects our costs because we have significant fuel theft. That's a factor in our economic discussion.
Yes.
It's not a factor in other jurisdictions, but it makes a big difference when we're able to cut fuel theft right across government.
Please.
Right? So it makes a big difference, and that changes the conversation. No, I support your point 100%. Globally, EV transition will be difficult between now and 2030. But I think because of our market size, I'm hoping that we're able to access the volumes that we need to facilitate our transition.
And if I could build on it as well, I'm just noting this conversation we're having. I mean, we're talking about all forms of energy,
Yes.
and it's encouraging. We've talked about solar, nuclear, hydro. We're talking about electric vehicles. And as Canadians, we are prepared to meaningfully engage on each of those topics with you. We have real lessons, real life lessons to share. Our largest province, Ontario, went through net metering to enable solar and wind. And currently in that province, people are selling back to the grid. And there has been uptake in that regard. So we can talk meaningfully with you about that, if that is the direction that Jamaica wants to go. But also with vehicles and transportation, it's also good to remember that electric vehicles, they capture a lot of attention because there are personal vehicles. And it's something we can personally do. The next car I'm going to buy is going to be electric, so it's going to make a difference. And it's important. But you have to remember that in the transportation wedge of greenhouse gas emissions, our personal vehicles are actually the smallest part of sliver of that. The biggest emissions come from heavy haulers, marine shipping, rail, aircraft, and the like. And where a lot of where we see it going next on that is on hydrogen to meet that role and that demand. Good news for Canada is that we have a great amount of expertise. We have more people working in the hydrogen sector than anywhere else in the world. And we have, and it's owing actually to our traditional oil and gas industry. There's a connection, there's a connectivity, especially in the province of Alberta. But we have an ability to make blue hydrogen, which is basically natural gas where the carbon is taken out and sequestered back underground. We have that capability in Canada. Not everybody does. We also have an ability to make green hydrogen as well through the electrolysis system. And why? You can't make green hydrogen unless you have excess electricity generation capacity, really, as a country. In Canada, we have excess electricity generation capacity. We are the largest exporter of electricity in the world. We're the #1 exporter of electricity. So I guess the message I want to make sure we don't lose track of here is no matter what the energy conversation, we can have a very productive, robust conversation with you about it. And we have actual hard lessons we've learned. We've got some scars from some of these things we've tried, but we've also got the advantages that we've realized as well. And so I'm enjoying the conversation because I think that's what we're doing here.
Thank you. Go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. Actually, just leads into my point that it's been a great conversation, and I think it's extremely important that we're having this conversation and your input. One key point that I haven't heard a lot about is affordability. I believe, Mr. Wonder, you had mentioned it, because for Jamaica, I think that's the key. So my point is really about affordability and participation. So net billing that Jason brought up is important for participation, because whereas we could put a megawatt farm down in a year or two, that might solve our renewable energy goal, but we also need to ensure that people, the citizens of Jamaica, can participate. From a residence or a large business that could sell excess energy back to the grid at a competitive price, not at a third of what the utility sells it to the client for. Maybe it could be higher, maybe it could be less. Maybe it's right. That's a discussion we need to have. And active stakeholder engagement is something that is definitely lacking in the energy sector, 100%. And so this is the kind of thing that would bring stakeholders together. We need to have that more with our friends at JPS, with OUR, with the Ministry of Energy, with IRP2 coming up, 200 megawatts being discussed in the media. These are big things, and it's a critical time for Jamaica. But it's also important to realize that most of our, the JPS clients, and please correct me if I'm wrong, they're not using thousands of kilowatt hours a month. This is a normal Jamaican household in the country just using 250, 300 kilowatt hours a month, but still struggling to pay a bill because it's expensive, and that leads to affordability. So while we need to meet our goals, we need to realize that it needs to be affordable. We need clean, affordable power. Affordable, in my opinion, clean, because otherwise our GDP per capita is roughly a tenth of Canadian citizens, right? So we need to ensure that we are building out our renewable energy, whatever format that takes, with adequate thermal, adequate whatever, but we're going to put in there to ensure that we have a reliable grid, but it's got to be affordable.
And if
so
I could
think
just
that-
if I could just lay on top of your concern for as we ask you to respond, is there is a concern. I know that the ambitious target that we've set in terms of moving towards 50% renewables in the time frame we've set, whether or not we can do that while maintaining the affordability that you're raising. So I know you're saying everything is not a regulatory issue. It's not a regulatory issue.
In a way. So I agree with you, participation is important. I think prosumers being able to sell output back to the grids is important. But you don't want those prosumers and that participation to strand assets, because then others left on the grid pay for the assets. And I made this point before, and I know you understand that. And I'm not suggesting that's what you were suggesting. But I think we need to be careful about it has to be an economic proposition, both from the consumer's perspective and the system's perspective. But I think there are tremendous opportunities there. So particularly larger industrials who are self-generating, who want to hop off the grid, wouldn't it be wonderful if you could get that investment, which they're going to make anyway in their business, to somehow contribute to Jamaica's capacity and energy needs? And if you get the regulatory framework right, if you allow them to cover the costs they need to, but also benefit from what they have to offer, and you allow that to happen in a streamlined way, not an overly complicated way, everyone benefits. So this notion, this perhaps somewhat naive notion of, it's a win-win-win. Well, some of these propositions are, if you get the rules right, but you need to get the rules right. And sometimes those rules will say, we're not going to let you just hop off the grid but reconnect or connect whenever you want because you need backup. You need backup, you're going to have to pay for backup. And I don't think anyone can legitimately dispute that. So yes, the regulatory framework is very important to stabilizing that. And I think it helps use this grid, the alternative, prosumer approach as an opportunity rather than a threat. And there are jurisdictions that have been through this, and this isn't untrodden ground, but you need to be careful about it.
Yes. Senator?
The need and the urgency is perhaps even greater than we're discussing, because it's not just conversion, it's also increasing capacity. The reality, and why I started the way I did earlier, by reminding us that we are a dark country because we don't consume a lot of energy generally, is because we intend to grow. There are 5,000, give or take, hotel rooms in construction now. There is the prospect of 73,000 housing starts by 2025. These are in well-planned, structured communities that will be consuming electricity legally and connected to the grid. There is a significant prospect of growth in electric vehicles as a percentage of our fleet. We're going to need more energy. So it doesn't necessarily take off some of the older generating capacity, which some of it does need to come off because it's particularly dirty, it's not particularly efficient. But we have a lot to do in a very short period of time, and it's one of the reasons we're particularly happy for the interest that we're getting from our Canadian partners in this discussion, because it's a lot to do in a very short period of time to facilitate and ensure we have what the economy needs to grow, but also to ensure that we're also still cutting our emissions even with that increased economic activity driven by energy consumption.
Good afternoon. My name is Wayne Grant. I'm Director of Project Development with MPC Energy Solutions. Very good discussions taking place so far. I'm happy for that. What I've not heard being said much is any discussion around storage. Now, we have the ambitious target for 50% by 2030. But with what really comes to mind is, what is the strategy? Are we building out the solar and the wind, knowing very much that it's intermittent? We won't be able to have that stability on the grid. We mentioned nuclear, speak of hydro. I think in terms of hydro here, I think I heard pumped hydro mentioned. Is it that the pumped hydro that is being considered is being used to address current capacities for renewable energy? Or is it that has been considering what is now in operation with some buffer or some anticipation for the expected projections for 2030? Right? That's one. Two, to support grid stability, would it be wise, or would there be considerations for some separation from the transmission and distribution side to accommodate stationary energy storage to support that aspect from a grid perspective? I mean, it would be good to hear some perspectives from the Canadian scenarios. What would be the best approach as such? The regulation currently doesn't speak much to energy storage, and how that would be addressed from a policy perspective. So I just wanted to hear some views.
So I think the first part to start, Dan, if I may, is that pumped hydro storage is a significant part of Jamaica's climate adaptation plan and mitigation plan. Adaptation because we need to store a lot more water. We need to significantly increase our source water flows, and whether that's done through fresh water or desalination or a mix thereof, that's being worked out, and that's actively being pursued now. I think over the last 3 budget cycles, the Prime Minister has been at pains to discuss the fact that we are doing the technical work to assess how we proceed with pumped hydro storage. And we're looking at a number of solutions, and we're having a number of conversations right now. But that is a critical part of our pumped hydro storage. And depending on how you design it, whether you use the Canadian model or the Norwegian model or the Moroccan model, two dams, your dam, your water that you actually need to ensure that we're not having the issues we're having now becomes your battery in crude layman's terms. That's a large part of where the government will have to go, and that would take a session in and of itself. But just to note, we continue the evaluation of something that did come to us last year, which is significant, which had pumped hydro capacity from an energy standpoint. You wouldn't contemplate onboarding all of it in one; it just wouldn't be possible. But the water side would store 900 megawatts of energy, which is the sort of water that you need. Now, you couldn't put that in one location because you'd have too many line losses, both from the energy and the water side. But you do have the prospect of building significant pumped hydro storage. How you finance it, how you do it, how you design such a transaction is the contemplation that is on now. But we are sure that pumped hydro storage is a major part of our mix going forward. In that contemplation, we have re-energized a project that the Prime Minister would have spoken to, which is again a large-scale integrated project of such a nature, which is the Mahogany Vale. I believe that's an appropriate name for a dam at Mahogany Vale, which would pump water through the hills and would have a significant hydroelectric capacity with a secondary dam on the other side of the system. So 2 or 3, I'd imagine, will form a part of Jamaica's adaptation plan, its push for resilience, which has to include storage for energy, has to be well planned with JPS to connect to the grid at varying points, and has to be very well planned with NWC to connect to its water distribution systems as is necessary. I'm not a scientist, I'm not an engineer, and I don't want anybody to cringe, but I've not met a solar panel I don't like, right? So I think onboarding as much of that as you can over time gives you the increase in capacity that we are going to need. I'm not of the outlook looking at 1,100 megawatts. I want to have a per capita GDP similar to Canada would need a lot more energy. And if we don't, build in that capacity, it's a chicken and egg. When do you build the capacity for investors to come? Because an investor needing significant energy, you're going to say, well, I can't take 13 years for you to give me the energy that I'm going to need while you have negotiations and conversations. So it's we're going to have to build a little ahead. Let the investors come and keep building.
Just before the others come in, because I see them itching to jump in and respond as well. The question was also about regulations, concerned that we don't have an adequate regulatory framework for the storage issue.
So if you don't mind,
Sure,
I
please.
think there are two kinds of storage, and we should bear that in mind. So one kind of storage is the kind of storage that a power plant developer will put beside their plant so that they can shape a product and deliver it under a contract. You know, I want a certain amount at peak, I want a certain amount off peak, or I want it seasonal. I don't think batteries do seasonal, but pump storage might do seasonal, if there is some. So that's one kind of storage. That's kind of it's storage used to shape an intermittent resource for sale to someone under an agreement. The other kind of storage is a utility tool. It's the kind of storage that the utility would build as it would its wires and its transformers and its reclosers. It's a tool that manages the intermittent sources that it is being asked to or directed to or has volunteered to buy. It's a way, it's effectively integrating the intermittent renewables, which was part of your question. And so I think it's useful to think about those two distinct things when we talk about storage. One is kind of whoever invests in power plants, capacity and energy, whether that's JPS or private power producers, that's part of their investments, part of their machine that they build to deliver what they are being contracted to deliver. The really interesting storage, the storage will be used not to shape what's going in, but to integrate what's coming in unshaped, which really is the limit on the system. I think my own view is that's a utility project and should be a utility project. It's one of the tools, it's a very powerful tool that the utility can use to manage its system and accept more intermittent renewables. And so I think we need to think about those separately because one's a utility investment and one is, I think in this jurisdiction, probably a utility procurement or could be a utility procurement. They're different. And both are critical to the modern energy system that we're talking about.
If I may comment on that, from Canadian experience, there are pump storage facilities that are IPP, not utility driven. They sell into Memorial, for example, is one of the major ones. So there's another element to that also, but for sure, storage in whichever form, with a battery. Having built so many power plants in my lifetime across all fuel types, I can say it's a mandatory part of establishing a reliable base load system to compensate for intermittent generation.
And an economic system, right?
Oh,
The
absolutely.
beauty of storage is you arbitrage. So you store it when it's cheap and you sell it when it's expensive.
Of course.
And whether that's the utility doing that to moderate its costs or whether it's a developer doing that to maximize the economic return on their investment, it's a critical function of storage.
And in times of resiliency too.
And resiliency, yeah.
And
All of
it's
which is good for the customer.
And it's also worth thinking about how you want to regulate a pump storage facility, because do you treat it as a generation facility? Well, it is, but also it isn't. It's also a feature of the grid. It's not a strict generator the way a classic hydropower dam is, which is basically a provider of energy at all times. So that's something to consider too, is that how are you going to treat it? You're going to treat it as a generating facility or as a part of the grid. But I think also an interesting story I can tell from pump storage and storage of hydro. You may be familiar with our Niagara Falls in Canada, our great tourist destination. It's shared with the United States, and we have a joint commission that talks about how that works. You may be interested to know, that it actually acts as a giant reservoir for hydroelectricity. Two major hydroelectric dams, one on the Canadian side, one on the US side. And we regulate the water, we regulate the flow of that waterfall. And we control how much water goes over it. And what's interesting is that in their order of priority, the number one priority is making sure that the water is providing fresh water to the people of the community on both sides. That's the number one priority on that. Second priority, maybe interesting to learn, is tourism. We want to make sure that we have that nice unbroken sheet of water that's going over the falls at all times. Third priority is electricity. So it's just to say that when you do the water energy nexus, oftentimes the water piece is the most important part, and the electricity part serves it. So I think, you know, Jamaica looking at its water resources and being able to control water as a climate mitigation effort is extremely interesting, and is something where we have some of our own advice and capability as well.
I'd say don't trouble, don't river folks.
No, we just declared it an ecologically sensitive area, so it will have no further development like that.
So, all right, I have a follow-up. I heard mentioned earlier, I think by Mr. Hill here on affordability. So of course, we have enjoyed here in Jamaica a few assets in renewables. One in particular allowed us to have a very, one of the cheapest tariff as far as solar energy is concerned. We all understand also the impact the cost of storage would add, and not necessarily the ability to obtain the same wonderful tariffs that we would have had from previous projects. How then would then that fit in the picture of trying to bring down the cost of electricity available to consumers, knowing that storage actually adds a price layer on top of what you would normally have from solar itself or wind by itself?
Because without the storage, you can't have the solar or the wind.
Right.
So you can't look at them separately.
So it's a matter of scale then?
Yeah.
Okay.
But
So,
And thank you. I'm actually going to, you know, it's very interesting because let me first declare that JPS has one of its kind, a 25 megawatt battery flywheel facility based in Hunts Bay here, first of its kind in this hemisphere. That if it weren't for that, we would not be able to be accommodating the renewables we have on the grid today. And it's very important that the question was just asked because it's often misconstrued that that investment, as was being noted, was made by the utility. And it's often perceived somehow the raw solar production is not the total cost to allow any consumer, including us in this room today, to be consuming electricity in a sustainable manner. And it's very important that that understood. And of course, I agree, there is a huge gap in terms of, there was no regulatory vision in the past in terms of how you treat with batteries for whether generation purposes, grid stability purposes, which is a key domain that needs to be traversed. And we expect, hopefully, that to be opined upon pretty soon, and we welcome. We too, from the utility point of view, have similar concerns. But that is one, you know, you brought out a very important point indirectly that is often misunderstood. And I'm glad you are now contemplating what it means for your real true cost of production, which is often misunderstood in our business, and I'm grateful that was brought out.
That's an excellent point. So what's the capacity factor of solar? 30, 40, maybe in Jamaica? The more solar you put on the grid, the lower that capacity factor gets, right? Because you can't take it all. And how do you not take it? That's a problem too. That's a mechanical problem, an electrical problem. You're the engineer, not me, Howard, so I defer. But my understanding is, so the more solar you put on, the worse it gets unless you have a controller, which is what the battery does. And that's the utility tool I was talking about. So that's an excellent point. You can't talk about the cost of a solar panel. You need to talk about the cost of the delivered usable energy. And usable means that you use it when you need it. And you don't put it on the grid when you can't. And that's what the controller does. That's in between. It's a critical distinction.
I just feel compelled to also respond to that point there, because I think that's a great point, but it's not something that we do not understand. It's something that should have been done a long time ago, quite frankly. And it's not something to be applauded that, hey, you guys have done, you should have done it a long time ago. It's been discussed numerous times, and if JPS didn't want to do it, private sector would do it currently. And the regulation, JPS has very good controls in as well, doesn't allow for people to just do that on a private scale, because we can only develop a project 100 kilowatts and connect to the grid legally unless we have an auxiliary connection, which doesn't exist, we do not have any other means to do that. Whereas we're quite willing to dispatch projects that have firm capacity, renewable with battery, but the regulation isn't there. And so we understand fully that this needs to be done, but the question, I don't remember who brought it up about investing not just in the asset of a solar module or a hydroelectric dam or whatever renewable energy source you have to invest in the grid, its resiliency, its reliability, and upgrading it's antiquated. Some parts of it are antiquated. And that's part of the responsibility of the utility, right? And that's why you have people sometimes, because it's expensive and the utility is not moving fast enough, defecting. And I do not like this discussion about this is like, I totally agree with you. It's not a large-scale defection. It's not massively affecting our economy right now. I saw an article 2 weeks ago in the editorial of The Gleaner from the chief technical officer at the MSET saying the same thing. Grid defection, grid defection. That's not the case for it's a couple of big companies that have done that because, quite frankly, things weren't moving fast enough, to Minister's point, right? That people weren't investing, making it affordable, making it easy to interact with the grid at affordable prices and do what they need to do.
So what do you want to see going forward?
I want to see better stakeholder engagement from all sectors in the energy sector. I'm hoping that the Jamaica Energy Council will be that platform. It's important that the IRP information that is being developed, I believe it's concluded, is not only shared with JPS but with other stakeholders so that we can make an informed decision because, again, timing is essential. We're at this critical point in our energy development where we're developing renewable energy projects with or without, interaction from the utility. And I believe it's important to have the utility, but I'm not saying it's a solar only and not utility. Absolutely not. I believe that it has to be, better conjunction, people brought to the table to have discussions so that when they go to market, the government goes to market, they're getting the best set of inputs for the long term, right? Because at the end of the day, we are paying too much for energy in Jamaica and we want it to be cleaner, 100%. But if it's not affordable, reliable, and clean, it's not going to benefit us, right? And I think we need to it's very complicated. It's not just a 1 hour discussion that we can have in a panel, but everybody needs to be at the table. And we have a history that, we need to have more people at the table. It's not like 50 years ago where there's only one company doing energy. There are many companies now, but people need to feel like they've got a voice.
Senator, and then Mr. Irvin, and then we'll come back to the floor. You're satisfied that there are enough people at the table, Senator?
It's not my sector, but that is the role of MSET. But I'm satisfied that the conversations have been wide enough in developing the IRP, which will come out shortly. I'm satisfied that there is unity of purpose on bringing the cost down for energy, and that part is impatient of debate. I'm satisfied that the political discussion that brings a unified position, certainly through a joint select committee, is progressing, albeit a little slower than we'd like, but progressing in that space. I'm satisfied that we will hit our 2030 targets and that stakeholders will benefit.
Serving.
And maybe to bring two things together, very interested to learn more about the flywheel technology that Jamaica's leading. In Canada, we're at the forefront of some compressed air storage. There's a company who's a member with us and our store. And actually what's very interesting about them when we talk about stakeholder engagement, their project is done in coordination with the First Nations of the Oneida part of Ontario, where they are equity partners in the project. And I think I want to make sure we don't lose that point when we talk about Canada and energy development. I started by saying, and I want to make sure it doesn't get lost, that the way we do energy really matters in countries like Jamaica, in countries like Canada, and ensuring that you have the best effort possible in stakeholder engagement and also benefit sharing with people who previously maybe were not consulted as well as they could have been, or who were not engaged as well as they could have been. In Canada, we have learned a lot from our Indigenous people. Our Indigenous people have taught us how to do energy better than we have done in the past. And it's quite clear in Canada today, if you dare to build an energy project If you do not have sufficient input, participation, cooperation with the affected indigenous people, you don't have a project. It's the way it is now in our country. And we bring that sensibility to the way that we develop energy. For countries, for responsive democracies, it's the only way to do it. And so having these types of conversations to actually understand, is our energy actually serving the people who we serve, is where you have to start these conversations from. And it's very exciting to hear that that's the way you do things here. So there's more we can talk about.
Thank you. There was a comment from the floor.
Yeah, I actually, my good friend Alex, we differ on many things, but we're fully in alignment on the issue of affordability. But I want to deal first with the issue of the grid defection that Alex raised. And it really should not be dismissed, and I'll tell you why. Jamaica has done a phenomenal job in terms of its electrification over the last 40 years and so on. So much so that we have close to a 95, 97% electrification rate. But the truth of the matter is that the average income of the customers that are on the grid is significantly low. It's a fraction of what it would be in Canada and so on. So that number you are looking for, Alex, consumption number you're looking for, the average consumption is 156 kilowatt hours per month across all categories. But more than that, 44% of that of the sales of JPS actually are accounted for about by 2,500 customers, all right, on the small commercial and large commercial basis. So, and those are the customers with the ability and that are being targeted for independent self-generation and other solutions by people who are in the business. So that is why the whole issue of grid defection is far more an urgent matter than it would be, say, Ian, as we look at it on a general worldwide or global scale for Canada and other places, because it is happening in other places as well. But for Jamaica, there's a uniqueness about the makeup of our electricity demographic that makes it particularly a cause for concern. And I want to transition from that into the issue of the affordability of the energy transition, because I've realized that almost every forum I go to, that aspect of the issue of the transition is what is kind of pushed to the side very neatly and so on. We're talking about, for the minister referred to the price of electricity in Jamaica and saying our primary objective is that it needs to go down. And I've been racking my brain for the last many months on how is it that we transition downward electricity prices with investments, the kind of investments that we are talking about in the short term, and asking how do we cause that recovery of that investment, how do we create a downward trajectory in prices so that a 156 kilowatt hour consumer will actually see a reduction in her price that will allow her to consume more electricity. And I've not been able to get clear answers or a clear picture of how that happens in the short run. So I'm asking you, what are the regulatory tools that you envision or a regulator can use to effect that kind of transition, affordable transition? And I'm asking if our regulators should inject themselves more on the policy discussion to make sure that we have that balanced view as to how we achieve this transition, but in an affordable manner.
So what?
Just before Mr. Mondra answers, is it that in your estimation or in your analysis of the situation, you not just see prices perhaps not going down, but actually going up?
All around the world, the questions are being asked with the level of investments that's being required for the transition. What is going to happen to prices? And all the forecasts are saying, in the short run at least, the short to medium term, prices of electricity, the price of electricity is going to trend up. And I'm trying to understand, what do we see certainly in our jurisdiction and so on, that will not make that happen?
Got you. Yes, sir.
Amazing question for three reasons. Yeah, the energy transition is going to cost money. because the energy transition is being driven by the cost of carbon, which is a cost that we didn't pay before, that policymakers want us to pay now. So we're not going to see overall prices of energy consumption go down and transition off our historical energy system at the same time. It's not going to happen. So my view is that's a fallacy. The issue is, how do we transition in the most affordable way? Doesn't mean prices are going to come down. I think there are isolated cases where the system can be better structured, or there are legacy assets that you need to securitize or take off the balance sheet or something and lower electricity prices. But overall, this is not a free or a economically self-contained efficient transition. This is a transition to internalize a cost we haven't internalized before. It's an extra cost. We're not going to see prices come down, in my view. So we need to start with that. People need to realize that. It's not about saving money. It's about saving the planet. And that's not going to be cheap. So that's point number one. However, and we spoke about this earlier, I actually think electrification for an economy and a system like Jamaica's, which is heavily fossil fuel dependent, is an opportunity to lower the per unit cost of electricity, which is really what you're talking about when you talk about affordability.
Correct.
Because there are two sides. I'm not an economics major by any stretch. I'm awful with numbers. But conceptually, even I understand there's the cost of supply and the amount of demand, and you put them together and you do the division and you get a unit rate. And that's what your 125 kilowatt hour consumers are concerned about, rightly so. And your business consumers are concerned about, rightly so. So if you double your load and you don't double your costs, you're going to get a lower unit rate. And that's the affordability question. So if done right, the energy transition is a tremendous opportunity for saving the planet and actually having a more optimized, not a cheaper, but a more optimized system, which for customers is a huge advantage. The third part of the answer to your question is, what's the regulator's role? And that's the toughest part, right? It's not the regulator's decision to internalize the cost of carbon. It's not the regulator's decision to invest in electrification of the economy. What the regulator can do, but not in isolation, is help with the planning to optimize the transition. And when I say help, because I actually think, and again, Minister, you'll excuse me, I don't understand your jurisdiction as well as anyone else in the room does, except maybe Jacob. No offense, Jacob. But the government should be setting objectives like decarbonization goals, time frames, economic development objectives, pots of money that are going to be thrown at attracting investment. Those are all legitimately, democratically government policy decisions. Then how you get there in respect of your system, really you're the expert. You should be figuring out what the IRP is in that sense, right? Not in the objectives or the policy sense, but in the implementation sense. What do we buy? What do we build? When do we build it? What do we retire? When do we retire it? And how do we optimize that economically? And how much is it going to cost us? And how are we going to mitigate or moderate that cost? And you have a self-interest, which means the regulator sitting behind you should be reviewing that plan and making sure that it is actually delivering the most balanced and best value for customers. So my answer to you, sir, which was your initial question, you didn't expect all the other parts, but what's the regulatory role? I think that's the regulatory role. I think it's the last piece of the, they're bringing up the rear and making sure customers are protected. But the government has to set the objectives. You guys have to figure out how to do it. It's going to cost more money. The public's going to need to understand that. But done right, you can actually make this better for everybody. And the regulator's responsibility is to make sure you achieve that ultimate objective of making it better for everybody. So, no small task, but it's not the first. It's not the first issue.
Thank you.
My input.
Just a little thing. We actually don't do the planning of the system. Actually, the government also does the planning. The ministry does the planning, the IRP. But just to follow up, and this is now more to our minister in terms of exactly what you talk about. How do we double the load, and how do we move the load very quickly so that we actually begin to bring down the per unit cost? And I've just wondered if the government may want to think broadly, more broadly and expansively and boldly about, as we talk about electrification and how we do our transportation framework. whether we don't want to look at mass transit, electrified mass transit as a transportation solution that will do both two things, deal with our mass transit situation on the one hand, but also significantly increase the electricity load that then redounds to reducing the per unit cost of the power.
Now, just to be fair to the minister, and I know it's a question to the minister, but just to be fair to him, it's easier for me to talk about the opportunity, but there is a tremendous upfront cost to this. And I think any administration's ability to guide this transition is very much dependent on the financing tools available. And I don't just mean the government's treasury, I mean the broader financing tools, the institutional lenders, the multinational lenders, the development lenders, and how you structure that financing so that the costs are, the revenues are matched with the costs, right? The rates, the collection from customers kind of is spread across the life of the project, which you know better than I is a long life. And the upfront cost is daunting. So to expect any one administration to have an answer, absent that support, I think is a very difficult question. So I'm sorry, Minister.
I'm actually talking more vision than actual.
Yeah, understood.
There's a lot of green funding and so on that could,
right,
come together in terms of a project of that.
There's a lot more conversation about green funding than there is green funding, as someone that has hit the international pavement a bit more than most, even prior to being in government and then even prior to being in the executive. There's a lot more talk of funding than there's funding, and the bureaucratic and administrative capacity to access, deploy, report on that funding is limited. No, it's owed to us, but as JPS would know, what's owed is not always easily collected, right? So that's, I think, the first point. But it doesn't mean that Jamaica hasn't spent significant energy, invested heavily across administrations, to be fair to the former Portia Simpson-Miller-led administration, and to CCD directors and the PIOJ pounding the pavement, to ensure that Jamaica is front and center in attracting the sort of very attractive concessional finance and significant grant financing. And there are some major things on the horizon. Although, many are slipped between the cup and the lip, but let us continue focusing on those. And those will finance, I think, significant parts of the transition. And that is a part of the calculation that we're doing, quite frankly, that, not at the stage to speak to, but there is expectation of significant international support through varying funding sources, some of the usual suspects, some not the usual suspects. But we have to note there's some anomalies in our regulatory framework, in our energy industry, that other territories don't deal with. And we have to address those if we're to truly deal with the cost issues as well. And an appropriate system, just as an appropriate system has to be developed for social water, an appropriate system has to be developed for social light. And we have to look at the grid, and we have to look at other issues that are separate from the generation costs. There are other issues that we have to deal with which aren't the topic for today. And that's really where the earlier kind of immediate cost reductions will come from, if we deal with the structural deficiencies with how we deal with energy in Jamaica. But what's important with renewables is that it's a predictability. Once I've built the structure, well, this one is going to give you 20 years, this one is going to give you 30 years, or this is going to give you 10 years, there's some predictability in what that cost is going to be. The very fact that anyone like myself that wakes up particularly early and looks at whatever newscast at 3 a.m. will tell you that I never know what the oil price is going to be. But I do know what the cost of energy will be having deployed a renewable system. And the most important thing in a developing economy is predictability and stability. And stability in the context of the grid, which is why we're happy to hear of that investment, obviously one I'm aware of. But that's the basics. The other structural inequities and issues that we have to deal with aren't necessarily for the inter or the bilateral discussions that we're having here today, but we have some work to do internally. But we also have to, I think, acknowledge that some of the things you're discussing, like mass transit, light rail, We're not a reasonable discussion 10 years ago. We were a financial basket case, and we're not anymore. Now you're at the point where you can move from taking the macroeconomic stability you have to considering that sort of mass investment. And it's why Jamaica was able to be the only country in the region to qualify for the resilience fund from the IMF. It's not the same sort of IMF discussion we've had for decades. Now, that puts us in the path to start to look at things like that. And I'm all for electrification. And I think you will see that, you know, we're not going to go out and say we need X amount of megawatts at this stage to do this sort of project. But we are looking boldly at our transportation system. We are looking at significant increases in international travel. We are looking at the conversion of our national fleet. And we believe we will be able to access in our corner what we need to electrify our fleet. And I think these are the things that will bring unit costs down. You will get the economies of scale that you need. And but it's a lot of moving parts that have to come together all at the same time.
Okay, we're wrapping up. I'm going to be asking our panelists for their perhaps one or two most urgent recommendations they would make coming out of this discussion. Let me just remind you just of a couple of the points we've been discussing. The issue of nuclear energy was raised, whether or not Jamaica should look at that, in which case the regulatory issue was emphasized would be safety issue. I was going to say the call, but I should say the renewed call for re-examination of the commercial net billing policy, concern about the time it takes to get licenses for that. The issue of electric vehicles also continue to come up, along with discussion as to what further regulatory and policy incentives there could be to move us towards more electric vehicles as well. The call for better stakeholder engagement going forward, the question as to how do we transition so that prices don't go up and prices remain affordable, especially for the lower income consumer. The question as to what the regulator's role is in this kind of transition, and the answer was helping with planning to optimize that transition. And let's start with you, Mr. Shiro. Your number one recommendation.
So my takeaway from this discussion, which I think was very active, very exciting, is that as we reach out and participate and put in place different generation options, for example, to enhance our supply and our distribution, whether it's the IRP or not, we need to identify the total costs, recycle costs of the system, from start to finish. For example, whether it's solar, what happens to the solar panel after they have been, for example, exploited, all their benefits, whatever it is. How does it impact the environment? So the ESG, the total ESG life cycle, of the choices that are being made need to be factored in, because that's an additional cost.
Okay.
That is not necessarily upfront.
Okay, Mr. Irvin?
I think the more I listen, I come and listen and learn. I think Canadians in our energy system, the reason we've been able to improve is because I think, again, I've said it before, that our Indigenous people have taught us how to do better. When we develop in their backyards, on their traditional territories, we must listen to them, we must demonstrate that we understand, and then we must take actions that prove that we have listened and understood. And I feel that in listening here is that from a Canadian point of view, I come to you from the north. When I left home, it was minus 20 degrees outside. And now I'm here. And in the summer, actually, it's going to be plus 30 degrees where I live. So we swing back and forth between the two. But in Canada, I have to remember this as a Canadian. I have to know this when I engage with others, is that energy in Canada is a matter of life and death. We have energy security and energy equity in ways that other countries don't, because we have to. You cannot sleep outside in Canada for half the year. It is life and death. So we enjoy that. But we don't have issues quite the same degree as that needing to bring on load. We need to connect people to the system. That's actually an answer that can come on. I've learned that here today in the discussion, and I think we've got some ideas, I think, in that regard. And I think we'd like to talk more to you about this, share what we've learned, and I hope that you continue to talk to us because of the approach that we take. So Thank you very much. I'm truly humbled by the invitation.
Thank you, Mr. Montreux.
I said this before, I think decarbonization, particularly here, is a tremendous opportunity to address a lot of issues, and I think it's remarkable that you have a multi-portfolio minister who has sat here for 2 hours and engaged honestly and frankly in this discussion. I think that bodes really well, so I think a lot of credit's due. That's wonderful.
And great segue to Senator for the final comment.
I think the most important takeaway today is stakeholder engagement, and that stakeholder engagement includes utility, the other players in the sector, some newer, some not, some new citizens, and certainly our bilateral partners, not least of all our friends from Canada. The expertise that they have, because they have to, I must admit, and I was teasing him earlier that weather is quite uncivilized, but you know, it's engagement at its core. It's a race against time, and a race that we have to win. It's a race for our economic development and empowerment of our people, but it's also a race to really make sure that we contribute what we need to contribute to the climate fight while building our own resilience. So the only way to run that race, I hate to use the cliche African proverb, you want to go fast, go alone, you want to go far, go together, but we actually have to go fast, far, or far, fast. So we have a lot to do in a short period of time, and it's going to require a lot of conversations, such as this, in rooms like this and in rooms not like this. And it's going to require all stakeholders, and you guys will have to convince Diana about nuclear, so she can convince everybody else and then tell us to do it. I'd prefer that it happens in that order. But all right, thank you so much.
Thank you. And thank you so much to our panelists for their fantastic insights. Thank you all so much for being here for this rich, engaging, and enriching discussion. And of course, special thanks to the Canadian High Commission for having organized this fantastic regulatory and policy masterclass. I'm Jackson Miller. Have a great evening, everyone.
Thank you. So well done. Well done.
Very nice meeting you.
Very nice meeting.